Good morning, everyone out there on your notebooks and smartphones. This is FECC, the European Association of Chemical Distributors based in Brussels. My name is Dorothee Arns. I'm the Director General of FECC, and it's my pleasure to host today's webinar together with our very highly esteemed colleagues from ICIS, Will Beacham and John Richardson, on the topic, which is highly relevant for all of us, global petrochemicals under pressure, where next? And before I introduce John and Will in a bit more detail, let me quickly introduce our association so that you understand why we have an interest in it. So first of all, who are we? We are the only European association from the many we have in Brussels, which represents all chemical segments under one umbrella, and literally from one end of the value chain, which is fuels and petrochemicals, to the other end of the value chain, which is life sciences, which we define as cosmetics, food and feed, and pharmaceuticals, and of course, everything in between, because distributors and also the entire chemical value chain is actually extremely densely connected. We have all company sizes on board, from little startups to big multinationals. We have all chemical supply chain functions under one umbrella, and I give you a quick overview afterwards in the next slide. Worthwhile noting that a lot of our members are small and medium-sized enterprises and even family-owned businesses. And in total, we represent more than 1,600 companies across all parts of the world, but of course, with specific focus on Europe. And this slide gives you just a flavor, a small flavor of the chemical value chain which we are representing, and especially the distributors who perform supply chain functions like warehousing, recycling, formulating and blending, logistics and packaging, technical and regulatory advice, especially when it comes to users who are outside the chemical industry itself. And of course, we do a lot of research and development on new recipes and new solutions and services. So this is a little bit what we are, explains very well why this topic is, of course, a very burning one for us. And of course, this is an association webinar, which means we all need to comply to competition compliance as usual. And I think you know that we will not talk about any prices, any specific clients of ICIS or members of FECC. So that is, of course, the golden rule. Then I would like to encourage all of you to make it a very interactive session by sending us your questions. We will have 10 to 15 minutes after the presentation of Will and John, where we would like to take your questions on board. I will read them out loudly and of course anonymously. That is always appreciated by many of you. And then Will and John will take a moment to answer them. So please make use of this opportunity, because Will and John are such long-standing, knowledgeable experts. It's a golden opportunity to make use of their expertise. You can type your questions on the right-hand side of the dashboard, where a little question mark is appearing. And then there is a little chat box opening, and there we go. It will end up with me, and I'm happy to ask John and Will to answer them. So without further ado, gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. And I think they are very, very well known from the many very relevant ICIS publications. So for sure, you know Will and John already from LinkedIn and all the business reports, but now you can meet them, at least virtually, live and in color. So my pleasure to welcome Will Beacham, who is the Deputy Editor of ICIS Chemical Business, and John Richardson, Senior Consultant for Asia Pacific, based in Australia. So this is even a global webinar. So warm welcome to you, gentlemen. We are looking forward to your presentations. And once again, strong recommendation to the audience. Please don't wait until the very last minute to send us your questions, because it takes a couple of minutes to get it over to us in Brussels. Please, as soon as something comes to your mind, please tap the specific expertise of these brilliant two gentlemen. So I think Will is going to start. So Will, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. And thank you for inviting us back to have another chance to give the ICIS viewpoint on Europe's petrochemical industry now, and to look at future directions as well. I've been reporting on this topic for 23 years for ICIS, so I'm really looking forward to sharing some views and our data with you, and look forward to your comments and questions at the end. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's the agenda for my part of the presentation, which focuses on Europe. Later, John will give us a more global viewpoint. So here, the agenda, I'm going to talk a bit about the kind of pressures that Europe's under in terms of supply and demand. There's a lot of overcapacity going on globally at the moment. High energy prices, the impact on the sector in terms of finances. It's been a terrible fourth quarter for a lot of companies that we report on. And then the impact, the broader impact of a wave of closures, especially on the commodity side. And then I want to have a little look at the possible impact of Donald Trump's trade war, which is restarting, and the tariffs that he's promised to put onto Europe and around the world. And then at the end, a little bit on the way ahead. And here in this picture here is Ilham Kadri, who's CEO of Syensqo and also president of Fecc. And we'll return to her later as she describes how Europe's chemical industry is on a knife edge. So next slide, please. So I know journalists are often accused of exaggeration or hyperbole, but I think we can safely say that Europe's petrochemical sector is in a state of crisis, particularly on the energy intensive side, but also downstream. The region's still suffering from the post-pandemic collapse in demand and the run-up in energy costs, which followed Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And now, to add to the mix, we look forward to a year of record global overcapacity, mainly led by a massive wave of petrochemical expansions in China. So as CEOs have gradually realised that the crisis is here to stay, and with margins and profits falling, many have started strategic reviews of their asset footprints. And since 2022, there's been a growing wave of capacity closures and asset sales led by Europe, but also affecting other high-cost regions and older, smaller assets around the world. I'll show you data to back up these assertions during the presentation. Next slide, please. So first, let's talk about demand. Here you can see purchasing manager indices for the US, which is the blue color, Eurozone green, and China red. The PMIs are based on surveys of purchasing managers and show whether manufacturing is expanding or contracting, with 50 being the dividing line. As you can see, Europe's manufacturing economy has been shrinking since 2022. And this stagnant demand has been caused by the cost of living crisis, fueled by high energy costs, inflation, and interest rates. And this has especially hurt demand from important end-use sectors for chemicals, such as automotive and construction in Europe. Also, China's economy is stagnating, and this has had a knock-on effect globally, and John will return to that topic later. China's really important for exports from Europe, especially German exports of cars, for example. Now, the CEO of Germany's Covestro, I interviewed him last week, and he said that persistent poor demand is the most important issue for his company. It's even more important than the high energy costs. And Germany's economy has been in recession for 2 years running, which is the worst performance since the Second World War. Next slide, please. Okay, well, gas is really important for petrochemical production. It's used as a feedstock, especially for fertilizer production, and provides power, heat, and steam for many production processes. Prior to 2022, the price of gas and electricity was relatively stable, as you can see from the chart there. And it's not something that us chemical industry journalists were particularly interested in. That all changed after Russia invaded Ukraine, and most of Europe effectively cut itself off from supplies of cheap Russian piped gas. Gas prices spiked as storage levels fell, and the market adjusted to an increased reliance on liquefied natural gas, LNG. So I'd like to highlight Europe's ICIS TTF LNG price, which is the blue line, which you can see is still 3 to 4 times higher than competing regions such as the US, which is the green line, and Saudi Arabia, which is the yellow line. These sustained higher prices are a key reason why Europe's petrochemical sector is in such a mess today, especially the energy-intensive commodity side of the business. There are hopes for help on taxation and a boost to renewable power from the new EU Clean Industrial Deal and Q4 chemicals package, which I'll refer to later as well. Next slide, please. So now I'll give you the ICIS view on future gas prices. This is our forward curve for European gas prices. As you can see, prices are forecast to fall as new sources of LNG come on stream. In case you can't see the legend there, this chart goes out to 2027 from now. But so gas prices will still be substantially higher than other regions, even if they do fall, unless a political decision is made to reopen Europe to discounted Russian piped gas. Here's a quote from Aura Sabidus. She's a colleague of mine. She's an expert on gas and cross commodities. And she said to me, I asked her for a quote for this presentation because she is a gas expert. And she said, in principle, underlying fundamental factors point to a bearish trend in prices because there are expectations of additional supplies from the US and Qatar hitting the market. However, this market has been moving on sentiment, meaning that geopolitical volatility could override those fundamental drivers and steer it in the opposite direction. Many hedge funds have been trading on this sentiment, building net long positions, which has lifted gas prices. Another huge unknown is the outcome of the Ukraine peace talks. She said, I would not exclude wild and unexpected events, including the possibility of bringing the Ukrainian gas transit or even the Nord Stream supplies back to the table. This is an era of Trump and anything is possible. Next slide, please. So electricity prices tell the same story, really. This is data from the US International Energy Agency, which shows regional variations in electricity. The darker the colour, the higher the price. As you can see, European electricity is way more expensive than US and Russia. In fact, electricity is the most expensive in the world here, including other key competing regions such as China, the Middle East, and the rest of Asia. This is another important reason Europe chemicals are losing the competitive battle against other regions. And this is due to much higher taxation and carbon costs than other regions, as well as a market which doesn't really function 100% effectively because of gaps in infrastructure across the region. Next slide, please. So if you remember just one chart from this presentation, it should be this one. It really brings the overcapacity problem to life in a very visual way. The graph shows how much global capacity exceeds demand in the 6 main petrochemical building blocks. This is global. This has been building, this overcapacity, steadily since 2008 and really accelerated from 2022. And it's forecast to surpass 200 million tonnes, that's excess capacity over demand, by 2028, which is the last year on that slide. This overcapacity is being driven mainly by China, which has seen wave after wave of new projects coming on stream as it aims for self-sufficiency in chemicals, and we'll hear more from John about that later. Now, the red line is the global chemical operating rate, which, as you can see, is declining steadily. Next slide, please. So the previous chart showed the massive jump in overcapacity from 2022, and here is the net result on chemicals. Europe's chemical sector is suffering really badly, with operating rates the lowest of all key regions since 2022. Europe's the blue line on there. But it's not just Europe that's suffering. Even the Middle East, the US and Northeast Asia, which is mainly China, have fallen to unsustainable levels. Operating rates in Europe were estimated by ICIS to be just 61% in December 2024, according to latest figures from our chief economist, Kevin Swift. And with rates above 80% necessary for optimal profitability, it's no wonder that margins and financial results are collapsing. Next slide, please. So this is the same data, but this is the long view going right back to 1997. And with the purple line showing the average operating rate from 1997 to 2023. So China started its capacity build around 2008, 2009, and rates began falling below the long-term average from then on, as that chart really highlights. Plants need to work at high operating rates to be profitable. And the next slide is going to show you the impacts on chemical companies quite recently. Next slide, please. So here last week, preparing for this presentation, I went into ICIS News, which is our rolling news service, and I just cut and pasted headlines from the Q4 2024 financial results season over the past couple of weeks. And as you can see, there are net losses from a whole load of companies around the world: Braskem, Orlen, MOL, Celanese, Dow, Huntsman, BASF, Versalis, Covestro, Sabic, Trinseo, LyondellBasell. The industry is really in agony. And as you can see, it's not just Europe that's suffering. This is a global phenomenon, and Asian companies are also suffering. Well, with results like these, it's very likely that the current wave of plant closures and rationalizations will continue and even accelerate. Next slide, please. So here's a map which shows you how that wave of capacity closures and rationalizations has played out since 2022, when we started gathering the data for this map. Europe's petrochemical sector is now contracting fast, with 11 million tonnes of capacity shut down or rationalized, according to trade group Fecc, as CEOs adjust to these torrid supply and demand conditions. The focus is on Europe, but as you can see, it's not exclusively Europe. There are lots of closures in other regions as well, especially of higher cost or older or smaller capacity. We're updating this map constantly, and I can tell you, nearly every day we're adding to the list of closures that we're reporting on with ICIS News. Next slide, please. So I want to have a look now at the impacts of Donald Trump's trade war on Europe. So he's threatening 25% tariffs across the board on all products exported from Europe, and EU leaders have said that they will retaliate. So I think the key message here from this chart and the following one that I'm going to show you, that from a chemicals point of view, the US has a lot more to lose than Europe. This slide shows the top chemical exports from the US to Europe. Since the shale gas revolution, the US has built a huge amount of new capacity, far more than it can absorb domestically, and it's become a major exporter of chemicals and polymers, especially polymers such as polyethylene, methanol, and other products like ethylene glycol and base oils. And if you look at the horizontal scale, and then we'll compare it to the next slide, the horizontal scale there is from 0 to 2 million tons. You can see that in terms of LLDPE, for example, it's exported somewhere approaching 2 million tons to Europe in 2024. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here are the top chemical exports from Europe to the US, so going the opposite direction. And as you can see, the volumes are way lower. Look at the horizontal scale compared to the previous slide. The horizontal scale here goes up to about 200,000 tons. So you can see the top export from Europe to the US last year was benzene, and it was only something like 200 to 250,000 tons. So the volumes are a lot lower. So if high tariffs are applied by the US and Europe, US chemical exporters will have a big problem. They'll have to find new destinations for their production, and this is going to be in an already oversupplied global market. So they do have amongst the lowest production costs in the world, so they might be able to take market share from global competitors in other regions. Overall, though, we think tariffs are likely to dampen economic growth wherever they apply, because the tariffs will be passed on to consumers, and that's going to fuel inflation. But not everyone agrees. I interviewed Marcus Steilemann, the CEO of Covestro, last week, and he told me he was quite positive about the impacts of tariffs. And he said, here's a quote from Marcus: "Another major driver of demand growth could be tariffs in Europe and counter tariffs that might create demand. For products in Europe that are no longer, let's say, competitive being imported from Mexico or other places going via the US, we may be able to have a spur of demand for products that are built in Europe." Next slide, please. So another big issue for Europe's petrochemical sector is the Suez Canal. And since the war in Gaza began and the Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea kicked off, most shipping firms have diverted around the Cape of Good Hope, adding delays and rising costs to journeys. With the ceasefire, everyone's looking for signs that more traffic will return to the Suez Canal. But as you can see from this graph, this has not yet happened. Shipping is still roughly half of pre-war levels, but if the Suez Canal does get back to normal, there could be another wave of disruption and oversupply in Europe, as a large number of ships might arrive altogether, having diverted back from the Cape to the Suez. A normalising of flows through the Suez Canal would also open up Europe to more exports from Asia and the Middle East, something which will not be welcomed by local chemical manufacturers. Next slide, please. So what does the future hold for Europe? I'm going to give you a few thoughts now. I've shown you the pressures that it's under and the way it's contracting, particularly on the commodity side, and how overcapacity and high energy prices are here to stay. Europe or EU chemicals leaders are not just sitting back and watching, though, as I'll show you. Next slide, please. So here's a quote from Ilham Kadri, who appeared on my weekly ICIS Think Tank podcast a few weeks ago, and she had her picture on the cover, as I showed you at the start. So she's president of Fecc and was a leading voice in putting together the Antwerp Declaration last year, which called for a lot more help from regulators for Europe. And this is what she said: "It has been a perfect storm for Europe, with higher energy costs due to the Ukraine war, slower economic recovery compared to other regions, and a dense regulatory environment that can sometimes feel like quicksand." Next slide, please. So the new EU Commission has appeared to listen to Ilham and lots of other industrial leaders in Europe. And last week it published the EU Clean Industrial Deal, which is supposed to address the concerns about the deindustrialization of Europe through a series of measures which should protect and stimulate industry in Europe, with a massive focus on lowering CO2 emissions and fighting the climate emergency. Next slide, please. So here I've summarised some of the most important measures in the Clean Industrial Deal. As you can see, it aims to improve energy markets by upgrading infrastructure to improve connectivity. At the moment, chemical companies cannot access available renewable energy often because the networks simply do not exist to move the power around the continent. There are measures to boost low carbon manufacturing and a stronger approach to protection against unfair competition. Next slide, please. However, not everyone is pleased with this approach. Here's our friend, the Covestro CEO, who I introduced you to earlier. He wants a much looser, lighter US-style approach to regulation, where tax breaks are used to guarantee a return on investment years into the future. A company like Covestro is global, and he can choose to invest wherever the business conditions and regulatory framework are most favourable. So here's the quote from the Covestro CEO: "What we have seen recently is a purely ideologically driven agenda, where the idea that the state can rule each and every detail, and by doing that make the economy better. We have seen that every state that tried to do that has failed miserably." Next slide, please. So finally, here are some of the ideas that I've heard from chemicals leaders and consultants when asked about the future of Europe. Well, the industry has excellent technical and innovative capabilities and fantastic connections and relationships with downstream customers. Away from the energy intensive side, Europe can compete by providing solutions, products and services to customers which are all trying to move down the road towards lowering carbon intensity. And we should not forget that Europe's chemical industry sits inside the world's largest single market of almost 500 million people. Next slide, please. Well, that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening. I'm going to pass over to John now for his more global view on the chemical sector. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Will. All right, let's move on to just take control here, and then I can move on to the first slide. Right, so I think the important thing here is to think of why we are where we are today, right? And this chart shows per capita consumption. I'm using this chart now for a couple of years, actually. Per capita consumption of the 9 big synthetic resins, and divide the world into 3 mega regions. So bear with me a moment. This is important context. It will sort of help to explain some of the charts that Will showed. The green line is China, right? And the orange line is developing world, which is much more populous down the bottom. And the blue line is developed world, defined down the bottom, different regions. And what you see here is a remarkable period of growth, which will not be repeated, in my opinion. This was a historical one-off. And there were 3 reasons for it. There was economic liberalization following Deng Xiaoping's Southern Tour. Millions and millions of factory workers moving, well, millions of workers moving to the countryside to work in factories, to the cities, export-focused manufacturing. The population was very young at that stage. And then we had China's admission to the World Trade Organization in late 2001. All the tariffs and quotas that had restricted Chinese exports were removed. So China could take maximum advantage of huge government investment in manufacturing infrastructure, a lot of private investment in manufacturing. The boom of outsourcing, globalization in the West was at the height of its popularity. And as Will said, we're going away from that now. And then we had this huge economic stimulus package in 2009, the real estate on steroids, and with lots of spending on infrastructure as well. And then we've had what we call the Evergrande moment, or the Evergrande turning point in late 2021. And as Will's chart showed, everything went wrong from 2022 onwards. And my argument is this was a historic one-off, right? China's got an aging population, real estate bubble, which made a small proportion of the Chinese population very rich, but now real estate prices are falling. The demographics are really bad. The population is shrinking. One estimate is even the government figures can't be trusted on this, that in 2020, the official estimate for the population of China was 130 million people too big, according to independent demographers. So it's a shrinking population, the real estate bubble's gone pop. And of course, now we've got the problems with geopolitics that I can talk about. And if you then, turn this into tons of polymers. Now, the crucial context here, guys, is that whatever happens anywhere in the world, domestic events are overshadowed by China, because China dominates global demand. That's the key point here, right, on this chart. Completely dominates demand. So I've turned per capita, and you can argue per capita, of course, is a bit misleading because it talks about, you're not including exports of polymers, right? But here we have in millions of tons, right? And what you see here is that in 1992, China was 22% of the global population, 9% of these 9 synthetic resins demand, right, globally. By the end of this year, 41% of global demand from just 18% of the population. So China's outperformed in proportion to its population, right? The great hope, longer term, is the developing world outside China. So you look at the table on the right-hand side there at the bottom, 68% of the population, only 32% of global polymers demand. That's where the growth will come from in the future. But then if I now go on to the next slide, this is the killer slide, I think, really, and it underlines what Will was talking about before. when you had the 6 big petrochemical building blocks. Here I've just got ethylene and propylene. You see, I've got 1992, 2001, 2009, and that pivotal year 2021, which was the Evergrande turning point, and all the years onwards from then, right until 2035. Right? And you see that this is quite incredible. You've got levels of capacity exceeding demand, historic highs right out to 2035. So why are we in this situation? Well, basically, the chemical industry got China wrong. They didn't think about the demographics, which I've been talking about for years. I couldn't tell you when it was going to happen, but I told you it was a problem, right? Building. And the real estate bubble was clearly, out of control for many years, and it had to come to an end. But anyway, the consensus was that China would grow petrochemicals-wise at 6 to 8% per year. That was the consensus before 2021. And that was the basis for capacity around the world that's been added, not just in export-focused capacity in places like South Korea, the Middle East, and the US, but elsewhere on the assumption that China would be the tide that lifted all boats, if you like, right? That it was making the global market so strong because China was dominating the global. Even a cracker in Brazil, for example, right, could be premised on the idea that China was making the global market strong, even if that cracker was for the domestic market. And so too much capacity has been added. And as Will said, a lot of that capacity is in China about pushing towards self-sufficiency. So 6 to 8% was the view, right? And now we're looking at 1 to 4% growth. 1 to 4% growth. And it's the gap between that earlier expectation and what we see now in terms of growth that's the problem. That's the global overcapacity we're talking about. And again, it's because China completely dominates global demand. Now, the next chart you can see here is our forecast for global operating rates for just ethylene. And I can do this for any product, any region you want. It's just one example. Obviously, time-wise, I can't go through all of it. But here we have ethylene. And in theory, we have another decade of very low operating rates. So this will be the longest downturn we've seen very easily in the history of the industry, right? So we have average ethylene operating rates globally at just 79% right out to 2035. You do see them picking up, don't you? If you look at the chart from about 2031, they're picking up. But still, the average at 79%, compared with the long-term historic average from 1992, which is the start of what I'll call a chemical super cycle, which actually ended in 2021. But anyway, let's round it up to 1992, 2024, of 87%. That was the global operating rate between those years. Fantastic period of profitability. So 79% means, of course, very low profitability. So is this sustainable? Of course not. The industry cannot really function at 79%. So this chart will be wrong. There's nothing wrong in saying that. That's the difficulty of forecasting. We constantly update charts like this. We will do, using what Will was talking about, all the plant closures, right? And this chart will change. It'll be live. It'll be very dynamic. We'll keep changing it. So what I did here is I imagined how we could get back to 87%, which is your orange line in this chart, an alternative scenario for operating rates. And it's capacity divided by production to get to operating rates. I assume in both scenarios, here our base case, which is the average 79%, the alternative back to 87%. I assume the same demand growth or production growth the same as demand, right? Of around 3% per year. It could be lower than that, but let's assume 3%. So in order to get back to 87%, what I did was I kept lowering capacity growth, just manually lowering capacity growth, right? Down to 2.5 million tons a year average from a base case of 6.2 million tons a year. So more than a half capacity that we expect would have to happen to get back to normal operating rates. We know advantage projects in the Middle East will go ahead. There are a few in North America, not as many as the previous wave, but there are some. Going to talk about China in a moment when we look at the long term, but China might push harder towards self-sufficiency. This implies closures elsewhere, right? Will they be in Europe? That's the question we need to ask. Certainly places like South Korea. Japan has been closing capacity down for a long time now. That's probably going to carry on. Southeast Asia faces significant challenges. For the non-state-owned or non-state connected companies, the smaller companies in Southeast Asia are very, very vulnerable. And we've seen some closures, right? We've seen the Philippines and in Malaysia, we've seen some closures only this year. So we can go on about this, can't we? Sort of say how bad things are and get very gloomy, right? So what do we do? Well, this chart actually came out of a meeting with a client in Thailand a few weeks ago, where I didn't bother presenting any slides. We just had a conversation. And together we came up with 3 things that producers can do, right? So just 3 ideas here that might help. Saying they will help, might help. First one, that chart I've just shown you, make that chart live, keep it up to date, do it for every region, every product. Just had ethylene there, didn't I? So do it for all the polymers, keep it up to date. At some point, the trajectory will start to change. The forecasts will start indicating a recovery, right? And we'll see the forecast operating rates as plants close down start moving in the right direction. You need to be prepared for the recovery. Remember, be ready to increase production at that point when the recovery happens. So keep those charts live. That's really important. As Will was saying, we're in a very different geopolitical environment today than we've been for many, many years since before the Berlin Wall. So how good is your market intel on trade protectionism? This chart on the right here from my ICIS colleagues shows a number of chemical anti-dumping cases against Chinese products over time from 2018. You see the spike in 2024. That's likely to continue. If you're ahead of the game and you're a polymer producer, right, you find out, for example, that a Latin American country has put anti-dumping duties on Chinese polypropylene, just put it as an example, you move quickly. You're the first to hear, the quickest to move, you sell a few extra containers. So that's that change in arbitrage, you can make money, take advantage of it. And my new pet hobby, I'll come back to this later, is AI. I think you need to integrate AI into your work processes. Phase 1 is changing time and costs on basic tasks. I'll talk about phase 2 later on, but I really think this is AI has come along at the right time for us. There's great market complexity. There's a new tool that can help us. I'll talk about that right at the end. So this chart here is kind of summarizes the big changes potentially taking place in Chinese capacity additions. I mean, the thing is that China will remain the biggest polyethylene importer in the world, right? Despite their push towards self-sufficiency and even with lower demand growth. And we have a build your dreams vehicle here, BYD, Tang. And what China's doing is reconsidering, I think, the pace at which it will add capacity. And this will have a major implications, I think, for trade flows beyond 2030. What's been planned and what's been sanctioned will happen before 2030. There's a lot more capacity due on stream. After 2030, things are looking more uncertain. I think we could say that we're probably going to see a slowdown in Chinese capacity growth, which is good, right? And that's partly because refining capacity has been capped because of electric vehicles, right? They don't need the gasoline, right? The refineries, however, could be turned into chemical feedstock centres, as we know, even with existing technology, never mind crude oil to chemicals. That's possible. Some of the China crackers, however, are more than 20 years old. So there's been suggestions that we may see some closures of older crackers in China, and reports not confirmed, just rumours, that coal-based capacity may be closed down. But that may be more, I think, the carbide-based PVC rather than coal to olefins. And then what's going to happen to the next 5-year plan, which details of which will come out later this year. This is the 2026 to 2030 plan. If they're going to reduce carbon emissions aggressively, what does that mean for petrochemical capacity growth? Right, it's all about what the government decides to do here, guys. It's really important. And I think we need a detailed study into all these different influences, what it means for Chinese capacity growth, because it dominates demand globally, and its imports will remain critical for the future of the global industry. How much capacity adds is really important. And then the question is, how much capacity can they add based on their ability to directly export chemicals and polymers, like chemicals like PP and PVC, where it's swung to major export positions from being a major importer in recent years, right? Can they export PP and PVC without facing lots of trade tensions? And also indirectly, more importantly, all the chemicals and polymers that go into their finished goods exports in a more uncertain world of increasing trade tensions. I think these are the things we need to think about. And moving on to the next slide, that moves on to a world, I think, that's very different from the one that we've grown used to since the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? And the critical moment was that Mike Pence speech in October 2018, when he identified China as an adversary. And the Republicans and Democrats agree on one thing, only one thing, just about. China is an adversary, right? It's accusing him here of currency manipulation, of unfair industrial subsidies, intellectual property theft. This is really serious now for geopolitics, for the potential deepening split between the US and China. Now, of course, we have AI. More recently, OpenAI, which of course is a US company, versus DeepSeek. What will that mean? Who will win the AI war, right? We're going to a period of increasing protectionism, I think, globally, as this Economist quote from back in May last year talks about a number of government measures to promote local industries that have increased greatly in the last 2 or 3 years. And this is really important when we think about the developing world outside China, which brings me on to my next chart. So this chart here, you see just HGP and polypropylene net imports for 3 crucial economies in that giant region, developing world outside China: Mexico, Turkey, and Vietnam. These are export-focused economies, right? So the extent to which their export-focused industry can replace China's export-focused manufacturing industry in the event of the trade war getting worse. Or will they too also face trade tensions, increased tariffs, if the US goes after every single country, and becomes even more aggressive in terms of tariffs. But it is this region that offers the hope. At some point in the towards 2030, maybe 28, 29, it's this mega region developing world outside China that should take over as the major driver of global polymer consumption growth by volume from China, and could result in a new upswing, right? Because it's a much more populous region, it's more youthful, right? It's got a youthful population, but we have to consider climate change, right? And this is just one chart about Vietnam. Very worrying chart. If you look at if you read a book by Gaia Vince called Nomad Century, it talks about 2 billion people globally having to relocate because of climate change. Quite scary. Just looking at Vietnam, this is our base case for polymers demand for those 9 synthetic resins again, increasing out to 2050 around 2% per year, 3% per year, right? But according to Gaia Vince in her book, the whole of southern Vietnam, which is 37% of the population, could be beneath sea level by 2050. And 2050 is not that far away now, is it, guys? It's getting close. So climate change will become a critical factor in determining whether the developing world outside China can grow and really can boom in the way that we saw China boom during that chemical super cycle. I think it's going to be much more complicated to try and understand growth patterns because of climate change, the nature of polymers demand growth, the kind of materials that were required to mitigate climate change, and, as I said, the effect of migration. Finally, let me move on to my new hobby. My new, well, it's becoming very important part of my job, actually, more than a hobby, which is AI. Now, we've got Ask ICIS, which is a beta version of an AI assistant. So it's not perfect. It's under development, but customers can play around and use it, right? It will enable us to, AI in general, and hopefully Ask ICIS as it develops, will enable us to really use the power of all that knowledge online to master the complexity I've been just talking about, right? Pattern recognition, analyzing vast petrochemical data sets, unpredictable trade flows, complex supply chains, automating market intelligence. I could go on about this for too long, so I'll stop there. But it really is very, very important that you think about AI and how you integrate it. I know you probably are, guys, into your work processes. Think about what AI can do today in terms of the simple tasks, right? You know, writing reports or doing PowerPoint slides. But beyond that, we have a potential to model all this complexity in a way that makes forecasting much more rigorous, much better scenarios for us. Right? I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, wow, what a presentation. Thank you both for, yeah, a gloomy picture, I would say. I'm really happy that you flickered in some thoughts about the strengths of Europe, because otherwise we would have all fallen into a collective depression, I think. But it was very sobering, but at the same time extremely, extremely comprehensive and excellent. Many, many thanks for that. And in fact, we have a couple of questions here. Let me start with one which is referring to chart 32. This is also the opportunity to thank Diana, our own Diana Sakara, who is running the show behind the scenes here. Diana, can we flip back to chart 32, please? So is chart 32 just showing the global oversupply? Let's see whether we can find back chart 32. Yeah. Give us a second, please. Diana is investigating this. 32. Yeah, that's the one, I think. So is this chart just showing the global oversupply?
Yes. Yes. Sorry, that's right, Dorothy. So it's the global oversupply. So it's ethylene and propylene. Global oversupply again. So I'm referring to China at the bottom because China has been the most important factor behind that global oversupply. Yes, it's global. Yes.
Okay, very good. So question answered.
I like John's chart because it actually goes further than mine. Mine stops at 2028, but John's pushed right out to 2035 as well. And it shows the situation's going to stay terribly oversupplied well into the future.
Yes, and it also showed you a really dream team, the two of you. So I think this question is answered now. So next question. Can you mention the role of India, please? Will refinery integrated crackers, ethane crackers, still be built in this region? So maybe let's start with the first one. The role of India?
Sorry. Yeah, sorry, Dorothy. Yeah, I mean, it's always been difficult to build chemical plants in India because of the regulatory stuff, right? The getting the land, getting the approvals, right? The power supply, etc. That's still the case today, but Indian demand is double digit per year. It's booming, and they will build lots of capacity, right? But it won't be enough to prevent India being a significant net importer of the polymers. In terms of ethane crackers, Reliance in Gujarat already has some ethane crackers based on imported US ethane, right? They converted those crackers from naphtha quite a few years ago. I'm not sure whether they'll be bringing any more ethane from the US in, but that's becoming an increasing trend globally now, US ethane being exported around the world. But there's a lot of refineries being built in India, which will, increase polyethylene and polypropylene capacity, but still they'll be big net importers by 2030, 2035, we think. And bigger than China in polypropylene. That's the key point, I think. In polypropylene, they'll be a bigger net importer than China very soon. More important market, even though in consumption terms, India is so much smaller than China.
Just to add to that, John, I just remembered that I read a story on our newswire last week, and the headline is India petrochemical production pivots to imported ethane feed.
Oh, wow.
I'll just read the intro. A growing number of petrochemical companies in India are looking at using more ethane instead of the more expensive naphtha as a feedstock for production, which may help reduce the South Asian country's trade deficit with the US in the coming years.
No, I'm behind. I should have read my news. But right, well, because that's happening in Vietnam. Simon Cement Group, Long Song project is a naphtha cracker, right? And LPG based on the LPG from Qatar. And they've closed it down temporarily while they convert to US ethane. So clearly this is a growing trend, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah, there was just another question which fits very well into this topic. How do you factor, is China going to become net polypropylene net exporter in the near future?
Yes.
Is China going to become net polypropylene and net exporter in the near future?
I think, yeah, I think, yes, I think certainly in terms of the commodity grades, right? Raffia injection, BOPP film grade, that's just almost disappeared as a market, right? Already, and they're a major exporter of those grades. Well, BOPP and raffia, not as much injection. They'll probably still have to import the copolymer grades for a few more years, but don't bet on it lasting that much longer, because they're really pushing to increase the number of higher value grades they make in polymers in general. So asking for a specific year, but in a few years' time, I wouldn't be surprised if China, even in the copolymer grades, is a net exporter. Maybe before 2030 is a possibility.
And just to add to what John said, looking at the polyethylene side, some of our Asia team published an article last week too, which was looking at a big wave of polyethylene capacity expansions coming on stream this year, and pointing out that there'll have to be maybe capacity closures of smaller, older polyethylene plants, but also that pointing out that, as John said, China's becoming more sophisticated in terms of the grades that they can offer. So we can't rely on them just producing the commodities for too much longer.
Wow, I guess still a lot of questions in. So, and we have 5 minutes left, more or less. So quickly to the next question. So how will demand surge in India, Vietnam, and Saudi Arabia impact market balance in polyolefins, ethane, and ethylene? So India, Vietnam, and Saudi Arabia.
I mean, India, I think the thing with India is they can't keep up with their demand. And so that means as a net importer, those net import levels will at least stay where they are today, probably increase actually for the next 10 years. So they can't add enough capacity to serve that local market. But the problem, Dorothy, is that everyone's competing for that market. There's lots of competition for the Indian market, right? Because it's one of the sort of bright spots, as is Turkey, right, as a big net import market. Saudi Arabia is really very small in terms of demand. It's more of an exporting, much more important as an exporter.
Okay, then next question. How do you factor resilience economic security considerations by governments on the oversupply situation?
Well, I guess this is a kind of pointing towards the idea that there's going to be more protectionism as oversupply continues to grow, especially fueled by what's coming out of China. I think we're going to see more protectionist measures. In fact, this clean industrial deal states quite explicitly that we need to protect Europe's industrial base from unfair exports, and it could be in terms of tariffs or anti-dumping duties. But I think we're going to see more and more of this behaviour by governments, and possibly markets becoming more regionalised again, because as each region tries to protect its own industrial base, perhaps there'll be people talk about the end of globalization, the end of global trade, which I think is maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but we could see definitely more intra-regional activity.
Yeah, and usually protectionism on one side triggers other protectionism measures on other side, so it's actually a lose-lose game. But okay.
Well, this is an interesting point, isn't it? You know, it's some people say it's a lose-lose because it fuels inflation. When you put all these tariffs on, those higher costs are just eventually transferred to the end consumer, and so inflation goes up, and everyone's got less disposable income. But then the Covestro CEO last week was saying, "Oh, this could be really good, because if there's less pressure of imports coming into Europe, then that could be good for Europe's industrial base. That could stimulate domestic demand, domestic manufacturing." So there's so many different views on that topic.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, let's move on in the interest of time. So will all participants receive a copy of this presentation? Yes, you will. And then that's the last question for today, because we have only 3 minutes left. How are Chinese companies adapting to the situation? Going downstream, going international, or what?
Yeah, I think what you're seeing is that the smaller companies, Dorothy, are exporting through traders, right? So they're just giving the polymers, and sometimes they don't actually know that it's ending export markets. They think they sold it domestically, it ends up into the hands of a trader, and it gets exported, right? Because domestic demand is weaker than had been expected. But the side effects of this world are opening offices around the world, right? And they're looking to be exporting directly. You've got, big privately owned polypropylene companies as well, opening offices around the world. So that's how they're adapting. They're trying to shift the volumes into export markets because of disappointed domestic growth. I think the other thing as well is gloomy about the Chinese economy, that it's going through a period of long-term, much lower growth. But conversely, it's becoming quite sophisticated as well. It's lower growth, but quite sophisticated. So the grades required are higher value. So that's what they're doing locally. They're pushing into higher value polymers with the support of the foreign joint ventures.
And they're closing. Sorry, John.
Go on, sorry, Will. Yeah.
I was going to say, and they are also closing capacity in China, aren't they? Older, smaller capacity, as that map shows. It's not just Europe that's got this big closure wave going on. It's happening in China.
Yeah, so we don't know how significant those closures will be, Will. That's the thing. We need to study into China's much more complicated in terms of the capacity additions from now until 2035. I think it's really changed.
Okay, we have 1 minute left. 30 seconds for you for a quick answer. European carbon tax mechanism, when will it be activated for polyolefins?
Well, I think the Commission's moving faster on that now. Beforehand, there was going to be no change to the existing plan before 2030, so they could have been added in by 2030. But people are now talking about possibly the CBAM applying further downstream. They haven't said anything about how much further downstream, but I think maybe chemicals and polymers could be brought in sooner rather than later, before 2030 possibly.
Okay. I think that brings us to the end of a very inspiring session, despite all the facts and figures, which are actually more prone to bring us down. But nevertheless, it has to be managed. And Europe is known for mastering a lot of challenging circumstances. So I think if somebody is ahead of the wave, then certainly it's also Europe with the pressure we had at all times. So many, many thanks to both of you, Will and John. Many, many thanks to all the participants who listened in and asked a lot of questions. And many thanks also for the positive feedback, which is now raining in the chat box. I would like to draw your attention to the next webinars. First of all, that's an open to all webinar as well, the FECC Digital Days, which proved to be extremely popular. We saw what is up for us in the market, facilitate your life by falling back to digital solutions so that you can concentrate on market dynamics and customers. And of course, more insights will be shared on all of that, what we have heard today and much more in our upcoming annual Congress, which we host in Hamburg this year in September, and to be precise, from 10 to 12 September. ICIS is a media partner of this event, and we're looking forward to discussing these and many other topics with a focus on opportunities. So where is the way out for us in Europe, explicitly in all this mess? So stay tuned, and many thanks for today. Take care, everyone. Thanks for your attention. And once again, big thanks to John and to Will, and also to Diana for running the show technically. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Dorothy.
Thanks
Bye,
everybody.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.